Okay, so welcome. This is the LaRouche Pack Saturday night class. We're just going to jump right into the discussion in class tonight, and see what kind of process we create from that standpoint. The reason we're discussing this class, it's entitled the LaRouche-Riemann approach to history, or LaRouche-Riemann method to history, is it's largely based on this question of a singularity, or concept of a singularity. And I could probably give this class 5 different times and it would come off 5 totally different ways, because there's so much wrapped up into this question. But hopefully what I can lay out tonight gives a first approximate sketch of what this notion of a singularity is and why it became so important for Lyndon LaRouche's method, what he maybe gathered from Riemann to some extent, though we're not going to dive deep into mathematics or even shallow. We're just going to touch upon it a little bit. We'll skip some rocks on mathematics. But the main question is to develop this idea. And in some sense, that's going to require redefining concepts like what science is. So there'll be a little bit of a kind of introduction towards what science needs to become. And then we're going to look at, there's 2 aspects to a singularity. The first aspect is, what is it? And the second aspect is, what is it? But the first one is, what is it from the standpoint of outside the singularity? And the second question, it is, what is it from inside the singularity? Now, why is this question so relevant today? And if people want, there's a paper that kind of defines this from the standpoint of a historical process called History as Science by Lyndon LaRouche. I think it's 1997. It's a certain rich period of Lynn's writings. He's come out of prison. He's intensely working on some of these Riemann, Gauss scientific conceptions. And it's definitely worth a kind of a study to understand that history is something to be studied as a physical process, not merely as a set of dates or an accumulation of ongoing events. But it has a very clear kind of evolution, you might say, and how we think of that evolution. And a part of that is this question of singularity. So we'll look at both aspects, and we're really going to touch mostly on the first, what a singularity looks like from the outside. But that's mostly just to set up the question, which is the most important question, is what is the singularity from the inside? And in some sense, this is to make human creative thought, human history, self-conscious, something that we can participate in, not grasping kind of in the dark, hoping that we're having an impact, but to actually make it possible for individuals, society, to act in a coherent and self-conscious, self-aware way about the future of, well, the value and contribution they're making towards the future. Now, I think most of you on this call already have a decent idea that we're in a remarkably historical moment. It's been my emphasis for weeks, if not months, that the most important strategic factor in the world today is what we might call the MAGA movement, or this American uprising. It's not just in the United States. It is in many countries. There's a major presidential election in Brazil. But whether it's Brazil, or it's Italy, or it's the Dutch farmers, or it's other nations around the world, the expression of this phenomena is still very distorted. And it's probably in large part due to the fact that the historical characteristics of our political culture is so distinct. You know, Brazil had a whole period of kind of a military junta running the country, post-World War II. That has a legacy, that has an effect. The effects of World War II still linger over Italy and all the instability that ensued in the 60s and 70s, where we've had major disruptions. And our government has made severe mistakes. Our leadership, our government over these last 50, 60 years have basically bungled the greatest kind of moment in human history. They've just destroyed it, but they haven't destroyed us. And you really can't ever destroy human creativity. That's kind of the art to our advantage. But we're really in a moment, and a moment reflects in two questions. There is great risk. We are facing the consequences of a possible world war, massive financial collapse, economic devastation, the shutdown of industry and production globally on many fronts, the questions of how fertilizers and fuel will impact food supply, not just this harvest, but next year. Heating, keeping people warm just during the winter is a question on many countries' minds. We see the aspects of a police state in the United States, the loss of basic liberties, the loss of free speech, massive censorship. So all of these things, if are not prevented, if not intervened on, will escalate into something which you would say is nonlinear, meaning that it won't just continue as it is. It will all of a sudden dramatically get worse. Some people might say that's a singularity, that there's a certain kind of cliff you fall off of, and that itself would be a singularity. And maybe formally that's true. But in some sense, that's not what we're discussing, is kind of good and bad singularities, or singularities objectively, and they could be good, they could be bad, they could be neutral. That's really not, and it's not really accurate. And I'll tell you why. Because that precipice off the cliff is foreseeable. I mean, everybody's now the eminent forecaster that's telling you what's going to happen in the future. Yeah, because it's like noonday. You can see what's happening. Lyndon LaRouche was discussing what's going to take place, the events unfolding, the kind of fascism you see, the liberal fascism, or fascism with a liberal face, smiling face, 50, 60 years ago. That was a bit more unique. So to say that just a rapid, precipitous change is a singularity, what we're seeing with this dynamic, this emerging political movement, and we are looking at a changing tide. We discussed this on Monday. We'll discuss it more on the coming Monday, but you see it in the polls, in the population sentiments, these radical abortion, radical transgender, radical drug aspects, the crime, the defunding the police, the war, even the Republican Party, even McCarthy in the House of Representatives, the House Majority Leader, complete DC creature, had to come out and say, and basically take the albatross off the neck of the Republican Party for whatever reason, maybe opportunism, certainly some level of pressure, that it's not a blank check for Ukraine if the Republicans take the House, meaning that Republicans are not going to be, at least from the standpoint of even in Washington, the rest of the country is not, but even in Washington, we're not necessarily going to be the crazy Dick Cheney, Liz Cheney war party. That's huge. That's the biggest stink that keeps people from wanting to vote against these Democrats. Am I putting Cheney and these crazy criminals in Washington back into power? Of course, it seems like it's all the same criminals in Washington, regardless of party. But there's a kind of shifting taking place. But if you know it from the inside, if you've been talking to grassroots groups, if you've been talking to the average American, these political manifestations now into the election, you could see it developing over the last couple of years. This is a distinct moment. It's not something reactionary. Maybe January 6th had some reactionary elements, but people even within that, not the million people in the mall. And certainly even afterwards, people said this was a setup, this was a false flag, this was a trap. We're in this to actually save the country. We're going to wise up. We're going to smarten up. If you're going to wage war on us, we're going to figure out how to fight back in a smart way. And you saw a movement begin to grow. They started to target city councils and county commissioners, state assembly races. And there's emergence in some ways of a vibrant dynamic of self-government, that same quality that had to have emerged in periods like our Revolutionary War. And in some ways, it's that question, which I'll come to at the end of this, which is really the question of how do we grow and make sure this is as fully successful as it can be, that we eradicate and eliminate all of the leading criminals that have been shaping our policy, and that we actually set a course not slightly different from what we've been doing, but an 180-degree shift, not even 170, 180. We're moving in the different direction, and we're moving up again. We're starting to find out what up looks like in terms of growth and development. These moments in history have that kind of power. But it's not just in human history. Well, in some ways, maybe it is all in human history in some sense. But it's the physical universe itself. And in some ways, the creation of these singularities, the willful creation, not simply a response to a collapsing system, which is to a large extent why this is finally has developed and arisen. But if we willfully create such singularities as policy, the creation of these kinds of moments by intent, that what you might say is the science of economics. To intend to create these kinds of uprisings of a people that are increasingly more empowered. And we'll touch on those aspects. Okay, so that's somewhat an introduction. Let me just introduce this in the most practical way, which is mathematics. So, okay. Oh my God, I just wanted to do that. Okay, sorry, wrong button. Okay, so this is this is a mapping, or it's kind of like, you all remember algebra? Well, back in the early 18th and 19th century, algebra wasn't something that was used to basically scare and brainwash every school child to either conform to very formal mathematics or to hate it for the rest of their life, or think they weren't good at it. But in previous periods, algebra was actually something kind of interesting. People were very curious about it, and they developed some really interesting language about it. Today, since in the 20th century, this language has been totally bastardized and formalized. So some of us have reactions to mathematics. But this is basically an algebraic equation mapped out. But these circles here are what you might call the parts that are the singularities of this surface. They're singularities because, and this only goes up to 3 in terms of vertical height. And I'm not going to explain a lot about the surface. I could, not a lot, but I could explain some aspects, but I just don't think it's that critically important. And if it is, we can come back to it in dialogue and discussion. But the nature of this mapping indicates that these two circles are going to tend towards the infinity, and that there's a certain value which cannot be mapped, that it actually is infinite within this function. It's basically like infinite from the standpoint of a fraction. So 1 over 0, or anything over 0 goes to infinity. So in this function, this equation, just an algebraic equation, at these 2 points, which I think are 1 and -1, it goes to infinity. It basically becomes a fraction over 0. Let me just show you a few more. This is kind of funny. People might think, my God, what are we doing? Here's another one. This is actually a mapping of a electrical coil. But again, there are certain values which measure in terms of how they're measured. And I don't know that that's just what was the website said, but but you get a sense that there's something distinct. And I'm laying this out because we'll come back to it in some sense. You want a visual reference point for it. When this was all done, and when Riemann takes it up later, there are no computer images of this. So all of the concepts that are made possible are not aided by these images. They're actually something that we have access to today. And just there's a few more. Here's one that's a 5. It's kind of like a 5th power equation. And so it's basically divided up a circle into 5 equal parts. That's kind of just the way algebra works. Here's another system. So each equation could have different kinds of singularities. Now, some of the mathematicians, the smarter, the most creative ones, just realized this was kind of interesting. What is this? How do you resolve this? But and let me just stop the screen share here. There's a sense of, well, how do we resolve it? Are these points knowable in some way? If we think of it as a metaphor for physical processes, like in some ways the one mapping was derived from dealing with the electrical coil and probably magnetic potential or something. Is there somehow gaps in the process? And what do they tell us? Are they significant to the dynamic as a whole? And this is what Riemann becomes so important. I mean, maybe I'll take the cat out of the bag in some sense, but I'll come back to it later. That not only are these singularities provocative, they're obviously stemming from, and the reason why this was so engaging for people like, there was a young Danish or Norwegian scientist, Niels Heinrich Abel, and then Bernhard Riemann, a German scientist. And he turned this concept into a notion of Abelian functions, which he then resolved in different ways. And this is just an introduction. We won't be sticking with a lot of mathematics or mathematical history. But Riemann does something very important. And that is to recognize that these singularities are defining to the surface. That if that surface is an example or a representative of a physical process, that process is almost determined by those singularities. But even more interesting was that Riemann recognized that there's something that, from the standpoint of those discontinuity, those singularities, we can create a continuous space as a whole. We can map the whole thing in a continuous way. Versus if you try to draw a line over that point that goes to infinity, you can't. You have to go all the way up to infinity to get around it to come back down. You have to go up the slope and then all the way to the top to come back down, and that's not possible. But Riemann finds a way to make it continuous. And this concept was really critical to, well, I think I think hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate to some degree it's critical for us today. And it's critical in thinking about how we shape economics and how we measure economic success. Okay, so so we'll come back to that a little bit later. What I want to do now is kind of, because the problem with the discussion of this stuff is the way that physical science has been so destroyed. And it's been destroyed much like mathematics and how algebra was turned totally formal. I mean, if you don't realize it, though, if you think back on your own education, it's hard to miss. Things like physical constructive geometry, physical experiments, were increasingly not a part of 20th century modern education. Maybe to some degree, and if you had a better school, it may have been more emphasized. But increasingly, they focused on algebra. algebra was kind of the litmus test. You almost started after you got past arithmetic with algebra. And this was derived from early 20th century, where they made a real, and it was people like Bertrand Russell. This is what we talk about, David Hilbert to some degree, but it was an intended effect to, and even to destroy algebra, because algebra could actually be somewhat fascinating, somewhat, but it could be. But if you just make it formal logic, you destroy it. Well, something's been done to science in a similar way, where science is merely, people might have heard this, there's a number of researchers, there's a top doctor at Stanford, there's this guy in Belgium, Matthias de Smet, who's done some work during COVID. There's all this research done. The papers are never replicated. Their tests are never replicated. It's people just doing research on whatever they want to research, whatever they can get funding for, which is ideological. And then no one ever tested. It just kind of goes out there, and they build their career on the ideology and improving their ideology as much as they want to and can. And the underlying factor for this is that a lot of it's premised on an outlook that all we're looking at is, in terms of science, is what do we see around us and can we describe it effectively? That science has been reduced to merely that process of description. That's not how people like Riemann or Abel thought. It's not really how anyone thought, at least not anyone educated or intelligent throughout most of human history. And certainly not the people we reference as the great minds. And in some ways, because the world has been made flat by that outlook, that all we're measuring are what we can see directly. And this is the marketing and advertising approach to tell people about climate change, or, you know, even the space program, even better things are, it's really encouraging through the senses. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Seeing the new James Webb Telescope pictures is incredible. But what's even more incredible is to find out about the underlying dynamics, discoveries that went into it, and what contradictions are coming up in those pictures that we didn't expect, right? The really profound questions of science are not the things that you're, in some sense, seeing with your senses, or merely describing as a set of events. You know, that's, if people, you know, this is what Isaac Newton does. Johannes Kepler discovered the planetary orbits, all of them, all 6 of the orbits that we knew of, you know, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and then Jupiter and Saturn, Mars. He discovered all of them in the exact orbits that we still operate with them today. I mean, we're somewhat refined today, but he discovered the orbits. This as a solar system with the sun in the center and the Earth, and knew the Earth's orbit was not perfectly circular also, and was able to hypothesize and come to determine all of that, and then even pulled it together as an entire system. Where Newton just goes, okay, let's come up with a statistical collection of describing what that might be happening. Totally different approach than developing the whole idea. Oh, so the reason I say that is because there was a great thinker, someone that Mr. LaRouche really looked to, that brought in a quality of what real science is. And I think this is important because in some ways, if we think in the universe in a healthy and you might say like in a truly educated way, we look at the great discoveries of the past or the great minds of the past, and we learn to recognize why they thought the way they did, then some of these things become much more natural and almost just a natural course of how we would think as human beings, the natural way of the human mind. It's not like you have to kind of push the human mind into some way of thinking that's right. That's not how the universe was created. And that's the main point of this, of Nicholas of Cusa. So you may be familiar with him. We haven't discussed him a lot in, I think, these classes over the last couple of years. But Cusa is a remarkable figure. And in some sense, he's the beginning of modern scientific thought. Kepler gives direct shout out to Cusa. He does it, I think, in the second reprinting of his first scientific work. But the person who opened up the whole era of science, what Kepler does is he basically takes Cusa's thought and the revival of Plato and just shatters the Aristotelian dogma and opens up a whole new quality of scientific hypothesis and creates the solar system, creates the whole concept of it. But a huge shout out to Cusa, Leonardo da Vinci, people like Luca Pacioli, who developed a lot of the, who kind of worked with da Vinci, part of the Renaissance. Also a huge shout out to Cusa. So all these people that come afterwards, the people that are exploring the new world, all hark back and kind of shout out to this guy Cusa. Now, to give a sense of Cusa's thought, even in one class it's always difficult to give a class on Cusa, but to go through much of his thinking otherwise. So I'm kind of name dropping to kind of give him his preeminence that he deserves. But the one aspect of his thought that I want to take and I think is critical tonight to break us from this idea that somehow science and human thought and even his participating in history is somehow reacting to the events or the perceptions that we have. Cusa recognized that this really is a flaw in the way that we've been operating. And the way he recognized, the way he challenged it is he knew, and even philosophers prior to Cusa, I mean, it's only really after Kepler that this happens. Even Kepler gives a sense that what he's discovering is God's creation, made knowable to the mind of man. So the leading person who introduces modern science and opens up a whole new world, there's no separation between God and science. That really only happens with Descartes, and it's a whole movement to basically separate religion and science. But for Cusa, they're very singular. But he recognizes there's a vertical hierarchy of qualities of thought. And the one at the lowest is sense perception. And at the highest would be the absolute oneness, or you could say the creator. He describes it in terms of different onenesses. But it's an absolute oneness at the top, where all things, that is, if from God's perspective, all of creation is ongoing creation of God. There's no separation between the two. It's kind of a funny irony, but that's how Cusa develops it. But he recognizes there are two domains in between. At coming down from the absolute oneness, he considers intelligence or the intellect. And I'm not gonna define these too much now, but I'm gonna give examples that are relevant to, things like history and economics. But he makes it, there's a quality of a notion of intelligence and then a rational soul, or we might say reason. And then at the bottom, sense perception. And he defines them in his own language. And I would encourage anyone, if you have the time, maybe after this election, because these next few weeks are pretty intense. But you can look at Cusa. He really is the bedrock of reviving. His philosophical outlook is at the very bedrock of the Florentine Renaissance, capturing the essence of what was transforming civilization. It was ongoing for maybe 100 years prior to Cusa, but Cusa captures what is this that we're participating in? A kind of a singularity like what we may be entering into here if we are fully, totally successful. And so that's, we can cite papers, you can talk to organizers. There's a website with all of his works translated, at least all of his most important works. There's a lot of them. So if you have the time, it's worth it. Hopefully this is a basis for reviving modern science, that if we break out of the cult of climate change, if we break out of this ideological stranglehold of materialism and obsession with sense perception, statistics, and just simply algebraic equations, that someone like Cusa is going to be instrumental and to help revive and to unify the sense of a creator and creation, that you don't end up in a reductionist world where does the human soul exist? Does the human mind exist? Does life exist? Are these just chemical processes? These things have been such absurd notions, but they've been at the very core. Those absurdities have been at the core of the COVID response, of kind of the Soviet communism, of Nazism, and of all of the cults of British liberalism, which is really the cult of all cults. These absurdities have been at the core of it. And so to challenge them is really to challenge, is to help, is really part of that 180-degree turn. So let me, to just introduce this concept, and I have to watch time here. So the next subject, how do I go from Cusa to get a better sense of what Cusa might be referencing? Well, there's a famous polemic that Lyndon LaRouche introduced, because the one thing we know that's near and dear to every American's heart is coffee. Now, you may not be drinking coffee, but likelihood is you are, and you might even want a cup right now. And so, and coffee's been kind of a cult phenomenon for a long time. Even back in like Bach's period, coffee was pretty popular. But what Lyndon LaRouche introduced was something of a way of understanding the process of economy in a way that I think helps develop also what Cusa was referencing. So when we think of a cup of coffee, if you ask the average 25, 35, 45-year-old today, whoever, you know, what's your sense of a cup of coffee? Give me your sense of this cup of coffee. They're going to probably talk about the blonde roast and how they like the light roast. It has more caffeine. They'll talk about maybe free trade or organic, or the condition of farmers, or I don't even know where coffee's growing. Where is it growing? They might have some basic questions like this. Mostly it's going to be the marketing and advertising of Starbucks and other big cafe companies and this kind of thing. How they make their coffee. Of course, there's all kinds of, I lived in the Bay Area for a while. There's probably 17 different ways to make a cup of coffee. But that's clearly not, we could think of it differently. And this is what LaRouche introduced. At the next level, we might say if moving up Cusa's scale, there is a sense of all of the different requirements to make that cup of coffee possible. We might call it kind of the domain of reason, where we look at all the various parts as a single process, or at least all the various parts as part of that cup of coffee. So you have the coffee growers, you have the land, it's in the tropics. You have the, but how does the coffee get to your store or to your cafe? Well, you have a whole logistical transport system from the farms to the ports. You have trucks that have been produced, roads, power supply. You then have a ship which has been made, navigation capabilities, questions of trade, of currency exchange. If you have paper cups, plastic lids, or ceramic cups in a silver, in a metal spoon, you have the sugar and cream. So where did those things come from? Sugar probably also in warmer temperatures. There's a whole economic aspect of that. But when you look at the cup of coffee, you see that there's a lot more that went into that one cup of coffee that you're consuming for, if you're lucky, $2 at a cafe. If it's pumpkin spice latte, it might be $6.50 or $7. I'm not sure that has any coffee in it though. that that's a lot more than what most people see when they see a cup of coffee. But that's only the second stage that Kusa might have developed. There's also a third. Obviously, we're not going to get to the fourth. But the third one would be take all of those aspects I just referenced, and perhaps much more. But we've touched on enough to say that even in a single cup of coffee, which is not nothing. I mean, some people argue that, you know, a lot of creative work would not be happening in science and art and writing. A lot of journalists, a lot of research happens because coffee is made possible. So it's not something, you know, it's intertwined into our culture in many different ways. Bach has a whole composition called the Coffee Cantata because it was such a phenomenon. But then take all of those component parts of that, what was made that cup of coffee possible, and look at it as a singular one. And then ask yourself, is all of the dynamic, the labor and farm, the fertilizer, the irrigation systems, the infrastructure, the roads, the ports, the shipping, the personnel on the ship, the logistics and transportation system, the currency exchange, the cafe you might be getting it or at the store, the equipment you're using to make it or drink it from. Is that whole dynamic operating in a way to continue to make that cup of coffee available over the coming 50 years, 100 years? Is it becoming more effective or less? Is it making that cup of coffee easier to provide or more difficult? So it's not looking at all of the individual parts, but we're looking at the entire dynamic, the whole as a singular system or process. It has its parts, but that's more from that's at a lower level that we consider all of its parts. We want to measure now the entire dynamic. Well, this approach, which is very much the way that when you look back at Plato's thinking, Socrates' thinking, Heraclitus' expressions of thought, that it is the natural creative characteristic that at least as from their perspective, this was the natural quality of the human mind, to think in these broken down categories. In some ways, that's the legacy of Aristotle, to break everything into parts, but rather to see it, that the unique quality of the mind is not just to measure all of the parts, but to be able to measure the entire dynamic and process. And in some sense, part of human history, part of this dynamic we're participating in, is that we go through periods where we have amnesia, we forget, or we lose sight of, because of complicated factors, because of so many new parts, or so many, making more and more parts known, that you can become overwhelmed, or or at least an amnesia to a more profound creative dynamic. This is interesting that we have this kind of cultural amnesia, social amnesia that can last even generations. Because from Plato's standpoint, the creative dynamic, even of the individual mind, is a process of recollection. That you're recalling something that was already intrinsically within the recesses of the mind. That the mind is intrinsically coherent with the universe. That there's an intrinsic interplay. So that it's almost like a microcosm of the universe as a whole. There's many aspects of what I'll touch on tonight that could be an entire class. Maybe I'll inspire some of my colleagues to follow up on some of these subjects. But we go through a process where something that almost is a natural characteristic of understanding, at least it seems totally natural when it's made clear, is also a profound scientific discovery. And so I'm going to share the next slide. This, ironically, is the forests and woods of Ukraine. At least that's what the picture says. I don't know where these mountains would be in Ukraine, so I doubt that that's Ukraine. So I think somebody was lying on the internet, God forbid. But the reason why I show this, and I'm sure all of you have probably at least hiked at one point and gone to places which are teeming, where there is wild, just a wild natural environment, you know, as far as I can see, you kind of immersed into kind of a natural national forest or something. Now, the reason I raise that is because this quality of recognizing a single unified dynamic was something that was reintroduced into scientific thought of the entire natural world by a Ukrainian-Russian scientist, Vladimir Vernadsky. And he developed the concept of the biosphere that was not all of its parts, because as I think many of us know, biology has been broken up into so many categories and parts, all the different plants and the mushrooms and the categories and the species, and everything is part by part by part. And Vernadsky had gone through intense study. He largely avoided literature and the arts because of so much political ideology. But he pursued chemistry, geology. He had, at some point, and this may have, he ended up going down to his farm in Ukraine and going on a long hike. Having gone and probably, I think, participated in a number of mineral research deployments into the various parts of Siberia and Russia to map out what elements and resources did Russia have, which, as we know, it's pretty plentiful. But this was still unknown at this time. This is early 20th century. But he's down in his, you know, land in Ukraine, and he recognizes that there's this quality of singular intent and purpose of the biosphere as a whole. And he also then recognized in later work, and how he defined that was something of a, well, it's a bit complicated. He called it biogenic migration of atoms. But basically it was that he saw that the life within this thing called biosphere governed by a principle of life. And that question of principle becomes important here because it's the singularity. It's the defining feature of the dynamic as a whole. Is shaping everything else in its pathway in a way that would have taken eons. The time frame would have been trillions of years to accomplish what living processes were doing to organize the same chemical material that was already on the planet, but now was transformed by and he saw that within the scope of this seemingly almost infinite forest that he was immersed in, that this forest was transforming the geological landscape in a way that was the most powerful geological force of any others considered at that point. And in some ways, that begins to get at a quality of singularity, that of a physical dynamic, of a physical process, but only emerges when you elevate the consideration of what you're considering as the phenomena up the hierarchical scale that Kusa had introduced. That we get beyond the senses, we get beyond merely the various parts that we see as part of the whole. But we look at the measure the whole of all those parts. My language may be somewhat limited, but I think you get the sense of what I'm referencing. So Vernadsky then introduces, and I'm going to have to just summarize because of time, that there's a process he also recognized of mankind. And I think I have a picture. Let me just, it'd be worth referencing it. hopefully it's the next one. Yeah, okay. So what he sees is that since he's early 20th century, more or less, late 19th, early 20th. But what he realizes is that there's a process taking place now, really since the Industrial Revolution. We as a species are no longer transforming chemical material on the planet akin to like other primates. And this goes back, you could go back even further. If you looked at periods of ancient Athens and so on, you'd see rapid changes in the city construction. Charlemagne did huge canals all over Europe. The canal system of Europe goes back to like the 9th century. But the Industrial Revolution was just and this is where you see climate change freaking out, because this is something profound. And he says this what he calls the noosphere, far exceeds the geological force of life. There is something drastically different in the dynamic of this sphere of activity in terms of how rapidly it's reshaping the chemical organization of material. So the accumulation of steel, of coal and iron is happening far more rapidly than the coal deposits or iron deposits happened because of living dynamics. And of course, this was celebrated in this 19th century painting, which is kind of remarkable. Here's a guy on the hill contemplating the profound beauty of nature. But as Vernadsky also saw, that this was a fully natural phenomena, that it was consistent with the overall process and course, even of life, even of non-life, but at a much slower time frame. But yet now something of human society. So, so in some sense, at that point, we've gotten, hopefully that was useful for some of you to grasp what we're referencing when we discuss economics and we discuss the entire dynamic of a process from LaRouche's standpoint, that we look at it from that level of the intellect, as Kusa described it. We look at what's the overall course of action taking place, but what is the process itself that we're measuring? And from Vernadsky's standpoint, the course of truth in the universe, the course of creation, as it's expressed within our sphere of activity, whether it's the sphere of activity of life or human society, which of course can expand to the moon or to Mars, but that this is what we want to measure, that these are the key questions of a singularity, of a process. Now, it's probably best, I'll try to move through this rapidly. Let me just, again, show my initial slides, just to show the, oops, get my keyboard back on here. So just the basic notion of a singularity. I just want to remind people of what I had referenced earlier, that when Riemann comes in, this whole question of surfaces was something developed by a scientist and the mentor of Riemann, this guy Carl Gauss. And Mr. LaRouche had my generation work extensively on a lot of this material. A lot of us didn't know it. Why then, per se? Maybe in some ways we did. But looking back on it, it has even a more profound impact. But Gauss developed a notion of surfaces to capture those domains of principle, to make visible that quality of principle governing entire processes, and largely developed this question of surfaces based on Kepler's discovery of the solar system. And Gauss continued that in his own astronomical work. What Riemann then does with these singularities, and I'm not going to touch on the mathematics of it, but I want to remind people of the 2 points that both Gauss and then Riemann, and Riemann states it very clearly, that these singularities are the defining characteristics of a process, but that they can also be resolved, that they're not something that you have to look at only from the outside, that you could actually see the entire process. So as if you're on the surface, those singularities look like impossible points, impossible summits you could never climb. They're infinitely high. But if you look at the whole surface from inside the singularity, everything is continuous. That if you approach it from that higher domain of principle, the principle governing the dynamic, then everything can then be made knowable. Or you could say, because that sounds a little passive, even though I think it's probably right, when I say made knowable, that the entire process can be made knowable from inside the singularity to everything outside, that everything can be acted upon effectively. That you can become causal. You can act upon that which is determining the entire process. Versus if you're outside it, you can kind of affect what people might see, but you're not necessarily shaping the process itself. So hopefully that's helpful as a metaphor and expression. What I want to show you now, though, is Riemann's insight was just extraordinary. These kinds of singularities don't just happen, aren't just, say, the principles of life or creativity and economy, which we'll get at more in a second, but they're actually in the physical universe. Riemann forecast shock fronts. He didn't run any experiment, at least not that I know of. Maybe he did, but it was something that he had hypothesized as a characteristic of gases in a pipe. But this is an extraordinary photograph of a plane and the various shock fronts that the plane is created by flying supersonic beyond the speed of sound. And in this way, the singularity is the boundary outside the plane. So in this case, above the plane here, is in a completely different environment than what's immediately behind the plane. Because everything beyond the tip of the plane's nose is affected by this shock front. And it becomes, some hypothesize we thought it would be like a solid brick wall. We couldn't fly past it, but that it fundamentally changes everything else. And you can't understand the aerodynamic design of the plane or its requirements without understanding how this is going to shape and be formed and determine the atmospheric conditions that are drastically, infinitely different in some sense than the atmospheric conditions out in front of the plane. So Riemann forecast that's a singularity. There's other singularities. There's a singularity around our planet. Actually, I thought this was the galaxy one when I looked at it initially. That's the magnetic shield of the Earth. That may be considered a singularity. At least it expresses itself in this picture. Certainly, there's also one, the heliosphere around our solar system, traveling through the parts of the galaxy. There's something with I think it was Voyager 1 and 2 when it finally left. It left the heliosphere and went into galactic space. It was no longer in the space governed by the principle of our sun, the principle governing the solar system. It had emerged into a different characteristic of space. So these singularities emerge in the physical process. They're also, this is something that some collaborators of Mr. LaRouche worked on. Many of you may remember this work. That there are distinct moments where all of a sudden everything changes within the biosphere itself. And one of those was within animal types. So people might have heard of the KT. These are mass extinctions. There's been so-called 5 big ones. The KT is the big dinosaur one. But this one, this may not be part of your daily thought process, but the Ordovician Silurian, 434 million years ago. It's not something we celebrate as a calendar day, though we may want to in some sense. But these are considered major periods of extinction where, in some cases, something like 90% of the species that were on the planet were extinct, made extinct, exterminated. So, people talk about saving certain species in the natural course of this process. But what they don't tell you is that 434 million years ago, when this great, huge, cataclysmic destruction of all life on Earth occurred, at the same time, there was an emergence of sea animals that were then developing the capacity to breathe and metabolize oxygen on ground. So at the moment that there are these mass extinctions, there's an eruption of an entirely different kind of capability within life. Now, we look at some of the characteristics that may be responsible for this. It's all somewhat, what's the word? Correlative, but it's provocative material to look at cosmic radiation, aspects of activity within our galaxy, our location, that heliosphere, activity within the galaxy. So, but in some ways, I'm wanting to develop this sense of that when singularities occur, they have this remarkable tension, and they have an emergence, an expression of a principle that is a characteristic of the entire domain. So for example, when salamanders emerged out of the oceans and onto land, their ability for metabolism their ability to act upon the surface of the earth became more powerful. And eventually we develop into mammals, warm-blooded creatures, higher rates of metabolism. That means greater rates of metabolism, greater amounts of foods that you're digesting, the greater rate of transformation of chemical elements on the surface of the earth. The activity of life on the earth was shifted in a profound way towards consistent with the overall direction, but there was this huge emergent upshift in the ability for that to occur. So this concept, this idea, was something that gripped Mr. LaRouche, maybe even from childhood, because in some sense, the creative process itself is like this, right? A discovery that you make. Many of the discoveries we made in early childhood, 1, 2, 3 years old, we don't remember, but they transformed our sense of identity. The ability to use language and begin to construct it transforms one's sense of identity. But we also go through other periods of great discovery. But he also participated in a major uprising of the American people. It was not sustained. It was somewhat compromised. But December 7th, 1941 was something that he constantly came back to as a moment where the American people's quality of courage and sense of sacrifice just erupted. And as a kind of conscious, self-conscious young man, he was able to identify this is what would have happened in the American Revolution. It's what would have happened as we approach the Civil War, as the morale and sense of self-sacrifice for a higher purpose and mission would have emerged. And that it's also what had emerged in the pre-war and war periods as a major economic driver of our country. And so he saw this dynamic, and he came to look at Vernadsky and Kepler and Cousins later. From his standpoint, these were something that he experienced as a phenomenon, as we all have, right? The creativity is not something that requires, huge amounts of formal education. It's a participation in the creative dynamic itself. You might say in truth. the participation in truth. But this, as he reflected upon this quality, he recognized that there were aspects of what was defining economics, moments of major upshift that could only be resolved by some dynamic, some higher sense of mathematics. And that not all transformations are equal. That yes, there might be different singularities, but and each of them infinite, but that not all infinities are equal. That some infinities can be greater than others. And what he found in going back to some of this creative work in mathematics by Riemann and a gentleman by the name of Georg Cantor, Cantor demonstrated that there is not just one infinity, that there are multiple infinities that you can categorize by different types of numbers. Kind of an amazing concept. But he said this is what's required to measure then the different kinds of breakthroughs. But what he found with Riemann was a sense that we could resolve, but that what we wanted to begin to make more culturally was that the culture within the singularity, the cultural expressions that we see in the American Revolution, or we see today in politics, the ennoblement of our citizenry, the sense of courage, sense of self-sacrifice, and responsibility towards self-government, a love of one's neighbor and of mankind, a true and honorable patriotism, that culture that emerges, we want to continue to make that the dominant characteristic of our culture as a whole. And that means we have to willfully drive towards these singularities. We have to create eruptions of major breakthroughs at least once every generation. And so let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Whoops. Share the screen one more time. Oh, I put this in here. You know, when you look at, and this was a critical feature, just as a kind of quick footnote. The introduction of fire into human history really begins to instruct us into the creation of mankind. Our ability to transform this planet more rapidly than any other, than all the collection of living species combined, all the forests, all the grasslands, all the animals, plants, mushrooms, bacteria, and viruses combined, we transform it at a far greater rate. You might say a transfinite rate. It's a higher infinity of power than life itself. That's ultimately from the introduction or the courage and willingness to use fire that became the basis of metallurgy, energy technology, and all the rest. But the one thing that was striking for Mr. LaRouche's generation, he's born in 1922, was to see the remarkable unfolding of a new era of science, like what Kepler had introduced. Einstein really couldn't have existed without Max Planck. It was Planck's courage, both in science and towards collaboration with Einstein. But Einstein's breakthroughs made all the things you see on the screen possible. I'm not sure if this is blocking. This is a laser guidance system for observations. Einstein's discoveries, much of which were made in 1 year in 1905. I think he was 25 or 26 years old. The lasers we use for all the barcodes, lasers for manufacturing, all the satellite technology depends on the discoveries and revolutionary conceptions of how we thought about the physical universe, how we thought about light and telecommunications. Einstein was sitting there in Switzerland in a patent office because his PhD in physics hadn't been accepted. And he's contemplating how are they transmitting? Because of course the Swiss are famous for their clocks, and they're connecting all of their clocks by electrical wires transmission systems to time everything. But he's thinking, how do you keep something precisely on time? By the transmission of light via telecommunications. And so you see how that question of time, light, telecommunications play into all of Einstein's discoveries, if you know more about relativity and special in general. But these questions apply to every satellite. Our entire global telecommunication system today premised on a profound sense of how we think about the universe. Nuclear power, Einstein made possible. The picture of the James Webb Telescope at the bottom left, all these galaxies. We didn't even realize there was more than one galaxy when Einstein made these discoveries in 1905, and even his general relativity of 1915. I think the Hubble discoveries of all the various happened like 1918, 1919. My dates could be off. Someone may want to correct me, but you get the point that what Mr. LaRouche recognizes, that the power of creative thought of a single individual. Now, the funny thing is Einstein's simply a single individual? Well, of course, yes, he is. At the same time, Einstein's family, they were Jews in Europe, so they weren't necessarily integrated in the various cultural aspects, unlike Planck, who was like a celebrated figure. But both of them were trained in classical music. Einstein would play Mozart's violin sonatas with his mother at the piano as he grew up as a child. Throughout his mature years, he's quoted as saying, the greatest influence on his outlook of the universe remains Mozart. And this begins to indicate to us somewhat what's inside the singularity, a profound sense of beauty, of awe, of imagination. I mean, many people know Einstein's quotes. They capture this much more profound sense, that God doesn't play dice. He had a sense of humor. But inside that quality was a great sense of love. But where did he get that from? Well, his family. This is only maybe one component of where one gets love. We're participating in the new era of electricity, of electrical production, and making that available to populations throughout kind of that area of Switzerland, southern Germany, Italy. And they were producing power plants. And Einstein, as a child, was basically working with his father and uncles, who were basically engineers, and figuring out how energy was produced and provided to a population. And this gets us to the second aspect of the singularities of economy. So there are great scientific discoveries, but those emerge in context. And yet what springs from them are some of the most remarkable aspects of either daily use, practical use, the industrial manufacturing of goods, but also an ongoing exploration of the universe, new energy technologies. But the final aspect was great projects. And that Vernadsky himself saw this, and Mr. LaRouche lived it, and personally dedicated himself to recognizing the role of statesmen in becoming, as Vernadsky described, the greatest source of geological change in the universe. Because they can set forth the kinds of great projects, like electrification that Einstein's family would have participated in, which to some degree was policy. But FDR, perhaps most profoundly and famously, unleashed the Tennessee Valley Authority and the rural electrification. Mr. LaRouche had to study these in depth, and how they were the unique singularities in the curvature of the development of our nation, because it transformed this area in the map, in the green, was the poorest area in the country, as poor as any part of the world today. And it was transformed into one of the most leading industrial centers, where the first nuclear power plant up near Knoxville at Oak Ridge was produced, 14 dams, massive transformation of the erosion, which happened every year, every flood year, stable land area for agriculture and production, for farmers, huge amounts of electricity from the hydroelectric dams, all at the most advanced technology, most advanced consumer products were brought in. And you can see it here. Here's a bunch of kids with totally funny expressions, but they were taking classes during polio outbreaks on the radio, which was made possible because of all the rural electrification that took place. Great projects, like great discoveries, transform an overall dynamic. And I'll give you the last one, which is also a common reference, is the Apollo project. This is the woman who helped make sure that the Eagle has landed. She wrote the source code to make sure, because no person could, well, it's just, these are the various women who were engineers. But Eisenhower, Kennedy, and the courage they had to fight against the military complex, to recognize that mankind can do the most remarkable things. That there was a love, as we see with President Trump today, a love of the American people, a commitment to advance the human condition, to operate in coincidence or coherence with the actual arc of creation of the universe, and to do that in transformative ways. And when we look at their quality of leadership, by no means perfect people, neither was Einstein. But when you look at people that were able to make great discoveries, statesmen who launched great projects and the effect those great projects had on people, we start to have some sense of the kind of culture that we want to create all the time, that we want to eradicate this low level of thinking. We want to capture the quality of mind and courage and leadership that's emerging out of the American people and people around the world, and turn that into a sustained quality of human culture. That really is the science of economics. That's how Lynn always thought of it. And hopefully that's at least, I would consider this an introductory course. It's an overview. So I touched on a lot. We may fill in gaps, but I'll open it up now. Maybe people have some thoughts and questions. We can jump into it. And hopefully this only emboldens us to act more effectively in the coming weeks. So I'll leave it there and see what you guys have to say.